Charter schools offer the promise of education innovation and an educational alternative within a school district, free from the bureaucratic strings attached to traditional public schools. But what happens when a charter school strays from their home school district and expands into a neighboring school district? That's the basis of a new report by our guest, California State Auditor Elaine Howle. Out-of-district charter schools. Does out of sight mean out of mind?
Additional funding for the Maddy report made possible by a grant from The Wonderful Company, harvesting health and happiness around the world. Chevron's Coalinga oil field and Fresno County have been doing side by side for over 100 years. Learn more at doers.com. From the California Channel at the State Capitol and the Maddy Institute, it's the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Kepler.
Welcome. The idea behind charter schools was to improve student learning. But what if money, rather than educational innovation, was the real motivation behind their formation? Our guest is California State Auditor Elaine Howle, who recently examined some out-of-district charter schools, and the results were a little bit unsettling. So before we get into discussion about your report, let's start with a basic question. What is a charter school, and how are they established?
Charter schools are essentially alternative schools to public schools as far as elementary, middle school, high school. Charter schools are schools where parents, teachers, the community can come together and say, we want to have a charter school to provide educational opportunities for students in our district. Or in some cases, as we're going to talk about today, the schools are located outside of the particular district.
Which is a little unusual. I mean, some of the things they're supposed to do is when they put forth this petition, though, they're supposed to have what? Comprehensive description of what they're going to be doing. They're supposed to have measurable student outcomes, a governance structure, a manner how to conduct a financial audit. All these things are supposed to be happening, but maybe yes, maybe no. Particularly in these, like focusing on out of district charter schools. So what are the responsibilities of the charter school authorizer, whoever authorizes the charter school?
Right.
So that's the County Board of Education or the school district or the state, right?
Right. I was just going to say it's either of those three. Typically, it's a district that authorizes a charter school. So
the vast majority are school districts, right?
The vast majority, over 80% of charter schools were authorized by a school district.
Okay.
And so what happens is the community, the parents, the teachers, et cetera, who want to have a charter school or establish a charter school, put all of the materials together that you talked about, a comprehensive plan, financial, projected budget, how are we going to enroll kids, how are we going to employ people, who are we going to employ, et cetera. They have to go to an authorizer. So a school district looks at all those materials and determines whether or not that information has been put together properly and well established, and decides whether or not they're going to authorize that group to establish a charter school.
And that becomes the charter,
That's correct.
Okay, so charter schools, you think, okay, they're inside a school district that approves this charter school, but they can actually be outside the geographic boundaries of the school district, can't they?
They can. It's an exception, essentially. So state law requires it to be within a school district. So if it's Sacramento Unified School District, their charter schools should be located in the district unless they can't find a suitable site within the district. Then they can authorize an out-of-district location, so it would end up in a different school district.
Cannot find a suitable site. That sounds a little ambiguous.
Well, there might not be facilities available within the district, so maybe they need to temporarily locate the charter school outside of the district while some facilities are being constructed. But in other cases, they just decide that they're going to have the charter school outside of their district.
But a charter school is not just a classroom school. It can also be a resource center, correct?
Right. There's a variety of different types. A resource center, online learning, virtual learning can be a charter school.
Anywhere.
Or it could be a physical, typical school.
Okay, so how are charter schools funded?
Well, charter schools receive funding from a variety of sources. Certainly they get aid from the state of California, much like a public school does. But then there's also some funding through Prop 30, the governor's proposal a few years ago that was passed by the voters. And then there's also some local revenue that they can get. In lieu of getting property taxes, they get some local revenue. So there's a variety of sources of revenue for a charter school.
And is local revenue the greatest source of?
Actually, I'm pretty sure local revenue is the greatest source. They do receive state funding as well, though.
But that state funding is based on average daily attendance. So it seems like the motivation here is to increase the number of kids in those seats.
That was a concern of the member who requested this audit. It was Senator Liu, who's now termed out, but she was in the education field certainly and was very knowledgeable. She had concerns because some school districts where a different district is locating a charter school in my district, they may be taking kids away. So I'm losing ADA, which affects my funding as a district.
So let me see if I understand this. So you have a charter school that's been approved by a particular district, but they may not be necessarily operating within that district. They may be operating in a neighboring district that maybe doesn't want a charter school.
That's correct. There are some neighboring districts that have actually rejected a charter school petition and said we don't want a charter school in our district, but a neighboring district says, well, we want a charter school, but we're going to locate it in your district.
I can see problems with
There
this. So
are
we're going to talk about operating these out-of-district charter schools in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Kepler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with Elaine Howle, the California State Auditor, about a report her office recently did on out-of-district charter schools. And wondering, when you start reading the report, you kind of wonder, do some of these school districts that have these out-of-district charter schools that they're approving, do they see them as some kind of like cash cow that they can make some money off these charter schools when they operate in these neighboring school districts?
Certainly, in some of the districts that we looked at, we were specifically requested to look at certain districts, and we did find these districts really wanted to increase their average daily enrollment, which affects their funding. If that average daily enrollment increases, or average daily attendance, I should call it, if that increases, then the funding that that particular district will receive will increase. So if I as a district, establish a charter school, but I locate it in a neighboring district, I may be pulling kids from that district.
They're not hurting their own district,
That's
right?
exactly right. They're not reducing enrollment in their own district. They're adding to because they're locating in a different district.
Of course, subtracting from the neighboring district.
That's exactly the concern that some of those other districts had. So it certainly is an ability for districts to generate additional revenue if they are able to get students from a different district to attend one of their charter schools that they've authorized.
You know, there's also the issue of administrative fees, right? So the home school district that has authorized the charter is supposed to take some money out for administering that charter school, but there's money there as well, right? They can make money there.
Right, they can make money there. I mean, what they're supposed to do is limit themselves to up to 1% of the revenue that that particular charter school receives for administrative costs, for monitoring and providing oversight for that particular charter school. What we found is some of these school districts that we looked at were charging a higher fee. They'd enter into an MOU with a charter school and actually charge up to 3%. They should be limiting it to actual costs or a cap of 1%. So some of them were charging fees they shouldn't have been charging.
Well, that's the other issue. Even if you charge 1%, but you don't deliver the services, that's a net gain, right?
Right.
You're not spending any human resource money or labor costs on that.
Absolutely, and we did have concerns about the oversight.
So school districts, when they authorize a charter school and they're going to be in a neighboring district, do they have any obligation to notify that neighboring school district?
Right, they do. They absolutely have a responsibility to notify the neighboring district. What is unclear in state law, and we've actually recommended that this be modified or amended to make it more clear, is what's the timing of that? Does it have to be within 30 days? Does it have to be within an hour? And we found at least one example where it was within hours of the authorizing district deciding to have a hearing to consider the charter. So there wasn't enough notification to the district where that charter school was going to be located to have an opportunity to argue, no, we don't want this particular school in our district. So there's no specific time frame in state law.
I would think that neighboring district felt blindsided.
Right. They didn't have enough time to really put a case together to say this is why we don't think this charter school should be located in our district.
So how does this neighboring school district challenge an out-of-district charter?
Another concern we identified in the report, there really isn't an administrative process for that district that ends up with a charter school to appeal or to go through a process. They actually have to litigate. So it's a very expensive process, and it ends up in court, and there's those kinds of discussions rather than having some kind of administrative process. First of all, enough notice so the district that may end up with this charter school has a chance to get into the discussions at the hearing and have a conversation with the authorizing district. But number two, if they end up approving it, does that district have the opportunity through an appeals process to say, no, we don't want this school in our district?
So you've got a situation, and the only recourse is litigation, which, by the way, is then costing that neighboring district legal fees.
That's exactly.
So they're getting a double whammy.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And that was the concern we had in the report, and why we made some legislative recommendations to clean some of that up.
Now, one of the things I saw in your report was kind of an interesting quote. It says, the state is unable to determine how many out-of-district charter schools locations actually exist. How can that be?
Well, that's because on an annual basis, Department of Education requires charter schools to submit their locations, submit information to the Department of Education. What we found is at least 300 charter schools did not report that information to the Department of Education. So the Department of Education did not know how many of the over 1,200 charter schools in California, how many of those were actually located outside of the authorizing district.
So you could have a charter school say, even if they do say, there's a charter school, they don't tell you all the locations where they operate, correct?
That's correct. That was another issue we identified. We identified about 165 charter schools that were out of district, but they had close to 500 locations. So it's not just one school, it's multiple, like you said, resource centers, other types of facilities. So it's a big problem.
So what do you want to see the legislature and school districts do to remedy the situation?
Well, as we discussed, one of the things the legislature needs to do is really make it clear as to when an authorizing district intends to locate a charter school in a neighboring district. They need to give them enough advance notice. We're suggesting 30 days because that's what's required for a petition.
Not 30 minutes.
Not 30 minutes, not an hour, et cetera. So that's one thing. And then identify some specific information that districts need to consider before they even authorize a charter. What are the things that we expect to see in that petition before we approve a charter school to be established? So those are a couple of recommendations that we made to the legislature.
Okay, up next we're going to talk about financial oversight. Could these out-of-district charter schools benefit from a little more financial oversight? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Kepler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with Elaine Howle, California State Auditor, about a report her office recently released about out-of-district charter schools. So one of the findings that you had was you thought that the authorizing school district should provide stronger financial oversight to some of these out-of-district charter schools. What kind of financial oversight are school districts supposed to be providing?
Well, it's interesting because they're required to do an annual assessment of a particular charter school, but they don't really have a specific requirement about what needs to be included in that annual assessment. So
assess it, but we're not going to tell you how to assess it.
Well, and each individual school district should come up with some kind of protocols or identify best practices. We mention a couple of entities in the report, the National Association of Charter Schools, and then there's a fiscal crisis management assistance team here in California that helps struggling school districts. They have a checklist of best practices. Look for the reserve balance. Look for, do they have an annual financial audit? Are they budgeting? Are they keeping enough money in reserve? They should have a certain amount of reserve. Each district is allowed to identify what that reserve amount should be, but are you asking for that information? And when you get it, what are you doing with it? Are you analyzing it? And we didn't see these school districts really analyzing the reports that they were getting from the charter schools about their finances.
So there's a checklist, but they're not necessarily for best practices, but not necessarily being followed.
That's correct.
So charter schools, let me understand, so they submit regular financial reports, but there's no description about how the authorizing districts are supposed to use those reports.
That's correct. That's correct. And we saw, a disparate use of those particular reports. Some districts would look at the reports, but then they didn't really follow up with the charter school and say, oh, your reserve balance is low, or you're projecting a deficit, what's going on? Or looking at their daily attendance information. Well, your average daily attendance is dropping, so what's going on?
Let's talk about some of those specific districts. There was LA Online that had some issues, Tri-Valley. What did you find?
Right, LA Online actually was one school, charter school that ultimately filed bankruptcy. And what we saw when we looked at a timeline of information that had been reported to the district, it really had some warning signs. They were projecting deficits year after year after year. They were trying to get a loan. They weren't able to get the loan. Their average daily attendance was going down. But the school district, the authorizer, was not questioning LA Online frequently enough and sufficiently enough to be able to figure out this school's in trouble.
The financial caution light is flashing. Nobody's paying attention.
Nobody's paying attention.
And in Tri-Valley, what was the situation there? I think they closed some of their schools.
Right. Tri-Valley also closed a particular school, and it was a similar situation where they're not paying attention to some of those financial indicators, the reserve amount, projecting deficits. Their balances are just not sufficient. I mean, a reserve amount is one, but just looking at their finances, looking at their average daily attendance. One suggestion we had in the report, and we've made made a recommendation to the legislature. Have a member of your school district on the board for the charter school.
As a non-voting member.
As a non-voting member, so you are getting the same information that charter school board is getting. You can bring that back to the authorizing district and say, hey, these are warning signs. We need to step up our oversight and our monitoring, or we need to step in and try to help rectify the problem.
Now, you were talking about some other things in your report about how these situations, the closure of charter schools could be avoided. One thing you talked about was written procedures. Why is that important?
Well, written procedures for not only the authorizing district to understand and be able to communicate to the charter school, this is what we expect to get as far as reports, this is what we're going to do with it, but then when we do an analysis, giving a written report back to that charter school saying, here are the concerns we've identified, we need you to tell us what you're going to do, or we'll recommend what you need to do to try to rectify the fiscal situation or some operational problems. So there's got to be some written communication so the charter school knows that the authorizing district is on top of things and they're expecting a response from the charter school.
And this, it's not like a school district, a host school district, or an authorizing school district has to make this stuff up. There's already best practices.
That's correct. And what I mentioned, the FCMAT, it's called, it's Fiscal Crisis
It's always,
Management.
they always abbreviate those.
Yeah, there's an acronym, but they go into troubled schools, but they have some really good best practice checklists. And the National Association of Charter Schools also has different types of checklists that authorizers, school districts can use, and charter schools can use to monitor their operations.
You know, one of the things you mentioned was having a representative from the authorizing school district on the board.
Right.
Two-way flow of communication, other issues of learning whether or not they can't support sectarian schools. So I want to make sure that they're non-sectarian, and this all helps with that communication, correct?
Exactly, exactly. It helps with the communication. Then the authorizing district knows what's going on, it has a presence at those meetings. As you indicated, non-voting member can't influence any decision making, but certainly is aware of what's happening with this particular charter school that district has authorized.
Now, you've already mentioned some of the recommendations you have in terms of financial oversight. So what, establish a minimum reserve?
Right, a minimum reserve amount, make sure there's an annual financial audit, make sure those annual reports are periodic reports, monthly, quarterly reports are being provided to the authorizing district. Those are some of the types of things that we felt were really important, and they're based on best practices.
And written procedure to follow, not just leaving it up there for them to do it individually.
Right, as much guidance as possible, not only for the authorizer, but for the charter school as well.
Okay, up next, we're going to talk a little bit about academic oversight. It looks like there may be a need for oversight there as well. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Kepler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with State Auditor Elaine Howle about a recent review her office conducted on out-of-district charter schools. One of the findings of the report was there really was a need for more academic oversight in some of these programs. So how are school districts who authorize these out-of-district charter schools supposed to provide academic oversight?
Well, it's interesting because they should be visiting each charter school at least once annually. Okay. But as far as measuring their performance, as far as academic performance, it's typically every 5 years when that charter school is up for renewal. And we had concerns with that. That's just not soon enough. It's not fair to the kids in that particular school if there are problems with
a high school class could have already graduated.
Right, or academic performance. And when we actually looked at some of the indicators, we found that the 3 charter schools we looked at, that the legislature asked us to look at, were performing poorly, not as well as comparable public schools in that region. So if you're not looking at that academic performance every
isn't
year.
That the whole point? The whole point of charter schools is they're supposed to be performing better than comparable,
and
quote-unquote, regular public schools.
Absolutely. But that's the expectation. That's why parents and teachers and the community want to put a charter school together, because they may be frustrated with an existing public school and they think this charter school will be better for their kids. But if they're not, the authorizer is not looking at that academic performance either annually or every few years, not every 5 years. That's not
too big a gap.
That takes too long.
You know, you're saying in your report that the annual site visit doesn't identify any specific oversight activities. It's unspecified?
Right, and what you would expect to see when the authorizing district looks at the plan to establish that charter school, they should have measurable outcomes. They should have expectations in that plan. This is what we're hoping to accomplish and provide for our students in this particular school. When the authorizing district goes in and looks at the charter school on an annual basis, they're not looking at those measurable outcomes that the school had intended to achieve. Why not? I mean, what are you doing when you're going in and conducting that annual assessment?
It's like trying to drive through LA without a map, right? I mean, you don't know where you're going and you don't know where you're going to end up.
Right.
So I'm thinking then you didn't see really any consistency in academic monitoring, did you?
No, consistency among the authorizers that we looked at. Again, we only looked at 3, but we did see some inconsistency as far as the frequency. I mean, they're required to do it annually, but again, looking at those academic outcomes or measures on a 5-year window is just not as frequent as we think is necessary for the kids in that particular school.
So it sounds like what you're saying is there's really a lack of timely oversight and feedback.
Timely, and as you said, there are certain outcomes that we're looking for. I mean, there's the standardized academic performance measures for, we looked at English and math, which is typically what you're looking at public school. And we have some information in the audit report that shows the 3 charter schools we looked at were faring worse. The kids in those charter schools were not performing better than kids in a public school. They were doing worse. But if you're not looking at that and trying to figure out, well, why is that? What do we need to do to alter our curriculum or provide additional services to those kids so that they perform better? Because that's the intent of a charter, any school, but certainly of a charter school.
Yeah, I think a lot of parents are working under the impression that, that this is going to be a better way, and that's not really being monitored. We don't know. Let me ask this. So the legislature wants to hold charter schools accountable for meeting measurable student outcomes. Are the recent changes in state law going to make it even less likely that charter schools are going to be held accountable academically?
Some of the recent changes have eliminated some of the measures that were in state law, but there's also some other modifications that will make it a little bit more difficult. There's fewer indicators. That's why it's so important to make sure that that charter, when that school comes and proposes, these are the measurable outcomes we want to look at, these are the performance indicators we want to use for our charter school, the authorizing district approves that. Well, when they go in to measure and look at things either on an annual basis, certainly the 5 years they're required to do that, but we think on an annual basis, they need to go back to that charter and say, well, you claimed you would provide these services to your students, and these are the academic outcomes that your students would achieve. It's not happening, so let's have a conversation.
Well, we have this new thing called the California School Dashboard, right? That's being applied to, quote unquote, regular public schools. Is that applicable to charter schools?
I don't know the answer to that question. I think it is. I think charter schools are required to follow that same dashboard. But even if they aren't, they need to have some specific indicators that they're measuring. We talked about the financial, but the academic indicators are equally, if not more important.
And if you're changing the criteria, then you don't have any baseline to go from.
Right, that's correct.
So that can be problematic. So we'll end up here. I'm sure you want to see the state legislature and districts do some things to improve academic oversight? Like what?
Right, and we made a specific recommendation to the legislature to amend law to require these authorizing districts to annually assess whether or not the charter schools are meeting those academic outcomes. That's an important change, and we think, we issued this report this last year, so we'll see if any members of the legislature take it up. Hopefully they do. We had interest when we released the report. That's a really critical recommendation that we hope the legislature embraces.
Okay, well, improving out-of-district charter schools. Thank you very much for that conversation. That was California State Auditor Elaine Howle. If you want to stay current on state and local politics, you can follow the Maddy Institute on Facebook or Twitter, or log on to our website at maddyinstitute.org. This is Mark Kepler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the California Channel or the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions expressed on the Maddy Report, visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.